Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming back to the Hilltop and the Center for Presidential History and the second go at our third rail series discussing the election of 2020. This night focused on foreign policy and focused primarily on exclusively on what each of the candidates proposes to do and what we think a Harris and or Trump, I guess it can't be or and, it has to be or, yeah, how each of them is going to function should they be elected. My name is Jeffrey Engel. I'm the Gergen director of the center, and this is just for those who have not been to our first session, this is a new initiative that we are actually resurrecting from before pandemic. Our third rail series is designed to allow people to hear the most difficult topics of our day, political topics, cultural topics, social topics, all discussed in a civil manner and all discussed with politeness. We have to remind people, I think, today that what joins us together as Americans, especially a week before the election, is much more than what divides us politically. So I have two speakers tonight who are experts in U.S. foreign policy who are going to offer their remarks, about 10 minutes each, and then we're going to have the opportunity for some good Q&A and discussion. So without further ado, let me begin. We'll begin with Charlie. Actually, I guess, should we flip a coin? I don't have a coin. Okay, well, you're on top. I begin with Charlie Edel, who is holds the inaugural Australia Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He previously taught at the University of Sydney, where he was also a senior fellow at the United States Studies Center. Prior to that, Dr. Edel was a professor of strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College and served on the U.S. Secretary of State's policy planning staff. Educated at Yale for both his PhD and his bachelor's degree, because he did not get into SMU, he is the author of multiple books, including The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft and World Order, and also of Nation Builder, John Quincy Adams and the Grand Strategy of the Republic. An officer in the U.S. Naval Reserves, he is working on a book examining the United States history of dealing with authoritarian regimes. And for those of you who are subscribers to Foreign Affairs, I'm sure many of you are, yes, this is the same Charlie Edel who wrote one of the principal articles in the last edition. So, without further ado, Charlie, the floor is yours, or Mike.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Jeff. It's great to be back at SMU. As you said, I applied not once, not twice, but 3 times. So thank you for having me back to Dallas this time around. We'll really appreciate sharing the stage with you, and to all of you who have taken time from your evening to listen to us discuss, to listen to us debate. I applaud all of you for listening to what has become an increasingly volatile debate. And we're going to try to do that without the fireworks, or at least without too many of the fireworks. So 2 caveats up front for you. So currently, I work at a bipartisan foreign policy think tank that does not take positions on any issues or particularly any candidates. I'm representing the Harris worldview and what the foreign policy might look like, but that doesn't mean that I couldn't argue the other side. Second caveat, we're probably, I won't prejudice Will's comments, but we're going to, in our opening comments, give you the wave tops, which is to say there'll be some details, but they'll probably be lacking, which means that you have to push us on our case once we get to Q&A. What I'd like to do for you is 2 things tonight, principally, laying out the Harris agenda. First is take a look at what we think we can expect from a Harris presidency, based on what she's done over the last 4 years as the vice president, and also kind of honing in on some of the statements and speeches that she's made, both while vice president, but also while out on the campaign trail. And then second, I think we want to shift this from purely analytic and perspective for what we think she might do to an argument for why that's more conducive for American interests, why that's better for your pocketbook, and why that's better for your sense of security as well. Okay, so first, what do we think that we can deduce about a Harris foreign policy? Now, when I kind of look at the universe of what's out there, I think we have to start with what Biden has done. She has been his vice president, and she has embraced that agenda. And then we can also look, as I said, around the margin of what she said while vice president, but also on the campaign trail. So the approach that she has championed, I think we can give you the top lines, is one of robust American leadership, of investment in the type of technologies that we're going to need if we're going to dominate the 21st century, on partnership, deep partnership with American allies and partners as a force multiplier for America, of antipathy, antagonism towards tyrannical authoritarian regimes, populated by the likes of Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can understand that in more finely grained detail. The first is just by looking at the Biden administration's national security strategy that came out in 2022. There were 4 parts to this strategy, all of which I think will be embraced by Harris. The first is to invest domestically into those industries, those sectors which are going to give us a leading edge. Think AI, think clean energy, think the energy transition, think semiconductors as well. Second part is aligning our strategy as much as we can with American allies and partners. Third part is competition, embracing competition with authoritarian regimes, both for who is the dominant force, but also who gets to set the rules that we all live by. And then the fourth is, of course, looking for areas of competition with all, including China and Russia. Now, another way of understanding this is basically to think of this as a twin-pillared strategy. That is, domestically investing in sources of strength for the United States and making sure that we have as many partners and allies on side with us as possible in a much more competitive, much more turbulent world than we have before. All of these, I would stress, are the aim of preserving American leadership, rallying others to our side, and undercutting both the power and the reach of our adversaries. Now, if you go through her statements, be it at the Munich Security Conference, be it at the vast amounts of travel that she's undertaken as vice president, I think I was looking at the tally, she's met 150 world leaders, she's been on 22 trips abroad, but you can simply just go back and look up what she had to say when she was giving the nominating speech at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago this past summer, which was a rather robust articulation of American power in the world. Let me just highlight for you what she said. She said she wanted to make sure that America was steadfast in advancing American security and values abroad, ensuring America always had the strongest and most lethal military force in the world, make sure that America led on new technologies such as artificial intelligence, make sure they competed to win in the 21st century with China, strengthening and not abdicating America's leadership role in global affairs and multilateral institutions, supporting Ukraine and NATO, and strengthening America's allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific regime. I think she summed it up at the conclusion of that speech where she said, defending American values would be core to how she thought about America's role in the world in its enduring struggle between democracies and tyrannies. Quote, I know where I stand, and I know where the United States belongs. Much of this should sound pretty familiar because it's squarely in line with what we have previously known for robust American leadership in the world. Okay, so if that's the diagnostic of what she's likely to embrace as the broad tenets of her foreign policy, let me give you an argument for why I think this is much better for your interests than the alternative. So there are 3 different things that I think about here. The first is, who would you trust most to manage big international crises in their endgame? Think about Ukraine and think about the Middle East. Who do you trust most to strengthen U.S. interests in those 2 regions and not undermine American interests at the negotiating table? Now, in Europe, obviously, at some point, we're headed to a type of settlement. But the question is, are we going to do so from a position of strength or towards one of accommodation with Vladimir Putin? In the Middle East, the Israelis have mainly hit most of their military objectives. So the question begins to come, what does the broader political and diplomatic endgame look like? We know that Trump has nothing if not erratic. I know we'll talk about the Abraham Accords too, a signature initiative of the Trump administration. But again, the question is bringing a large number of folks together as we begin to think about endgame. Second proposition I would ask you to think about. On most of the broad strokes of foreign policy, we are talking about affirmative actions. That is, getting others to come on board, not just simply wishing that whatever America says goes. And if we think about the transition towards clean energy, if we think about artificial intelligence, if we think about staying ahead on critical and emerging technologies, I think the question is, who do we think is best positioned to lead a broad coalition of states that will get to the future? And particularly when we talk about something like AI, where we're still defining the rules, but we know that there are many challenges that we face, not only societally, but also from a military perspective. I think we could say that Trump is likely to put safety concerns as a lower priority for himself. So when we think about the affirmative agenda, I would ask you who is likely to lead others. And this, I think, really plays into a third tenet. Foreign policy is team sport. It is contending for how many countries you can get on your side and throw at any particular challenge. The bad guys, I'll be a little bit on the nose here, are increasing their cooperation. It's making our challenges greater. So too are the good guys. Now, I know the Indo-Pacific region in the world best, and on this, Biden and Harris, by extension, have a sterling track record. All of our 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific region, we have strengthened, demonstrably strengthened our alliances with over the past 4 years. There are new initiatives, be it AUKUS with Australia, the UK, and the United States, be it the Quad Consortium, Japan, Australia, the United States, and India, be it multiple overlapping trilateral initiatives between Japan, South Korea, the United States, and the Philippines, which are really bolstering American presence and power in the region in the way that we have not seen before. Now, I think that Harris has expressed an inclination to double down on all of those partnerships and allies. Trump has demonstrably not, and when he's talked about doubling down, it's generally for the wrong team. Now, increasingly, I say that when we think about the major issues in front of us, we're talking about a competition between coalitions. If we think about the amount of stuff that we need to bring to the fight, defense industrial production, if we think about AUKUS, if we think about Quad, if we think about climate, if we think about AI, to win the future on issue after issue, the point is not simply how much power America has, but how much power it has in partnership with our allies and partners. I really want to underscore this point, because the critical advantage that America has over its adversaries are our alliances. China and Russia absolutely know this. It's a weakness of theirs, and they fear it. And there's only one candidate who fundamentally sees alliances as an advantage and a force multiplier for the United States. This leads to an important point for all of you. This debate that we're engaging in is about a choice that all of us as citizens get to undertake, but it's not a choice done in a vacuum. That is, you're not voting on whether or not Kamala Harris has a perfect and a perfectly articulated foreign policy. It's a choice. So you're not making it in a vacuum, you're making it as judged against the other guy. Now, this is not speculation, because we know what a Trump presidency looks like, because we've already had one. And I would throw out that for the really large challenges that we face on the national security front, there are several cautions that should be at the forefront of your mind when we think about a Trump presidency. First, the United States pays a chaos premium when Trump is in office. Repudiation of American security alliances, bare-knuckle negotiations with our allies, questions even over America's security commitments would make, and did make, the international environment much more unpredictable, and therefore lead our adversaries to want to test and probe how much they can get away with, and that is fundamentally destabilizing. And if we get Trump round 2, we're going to return to that. Second point, trade wars and trade barriers. There's one thing that we can say for absolute certain about Trump. He loves tariffs. Any issue, the answer is tariffs. He has said that tariffs would be imposed in blanket at somewhere between 20% to 60% on the world. Now, 60% is reserved for our special friends in Beijing, but 20 to 60% is a lot, and that means on American allies and partners who are likely to retaliate with their own set of sanctions, which means that another way of understanding this is on the consumer goods that you purchase, you are likely to have to pay 20 to 60% more than you currently do. Third, there's a certain mean-spiritedness around Trump's foreign policy. Now, sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not useful, but the implication of it is that it just makes it harder for allies and partners to want to go along with the United States for their own domestic purposes. It's harder to sell a mean-spirited United States that talks about American primacy as good for a foreign country X, Y, or Z. And I would simply say that when we think about what America tries to do in the world, it's just so much easier and cheaper when others aren't fighting you because they want to work with you. Fourth, I think we all know this, that we can debate around the edge of this, but whether or not Trump has the ability and the character and the temperament and the steadiness to lead. Now, this is not a debating point because I'm not giving you my own personal opinions. I'm simply going to quote his entire cabinet and his former vice president, who all have very strong opinions on his ability to lead and his temperament to be in the White House. Finally, let me just lay out that I think that Trump would be a recipe for American decline and global instability. He is both a foe of democracy at home and a friend of dictators abroad. We all know about the love letters with Kim Jong-un. We hear the words about Vladimir Putin, and we hear rave reviews for those like Xi Jinping who have power accumulated at their fingertips. He does not see the United States as the leader of the free world that's leading a coalition of nations who are working to push back an aggressive set of anti-democratic actors. Now, I don't think this is a light point or simply rhetoric to see that he could usher in a world that we haven't seen in decades where democratic nations are divided between each other and dictators think they can get away with whatever it is that they want to undertake. Now, we should be careful with historical analogies. Will and I were just talking about this, that not everything is the 1930s. But this is also a university, and you want to think about some of the historical lessons that we draw from different periods of American history. And in the 1930s, dictators drew support and inspiration from the lack of American leadership. They carved out spheres of influence for themselves. They suppressed democracy in their own countries, and they ultimately took the entire world to war. It was only after that great tragedy and that great upheaval that American foreign policy was willing to take a very different turn that premised that American deep involvement in the world, that American coalition building, that American championing of the rule of law, democracy, and human rights was beneficial not just for the world, but for America. It is this vision that President Trump continues to attack as a bad deal for America. He has raised questions about American security commitments to our treaty allies. He's explained trade solely in terms of economic loss, and he's displayed a complete indifference to human rights while expressing admiration multiple times in multiple fora for autocratic rulers. The president does not seem, and this is a key point for someone who's going to lead American foreign policy, willing to engage the world, rally traditional allies, and support democracy against those who are looking to undermine it both abroad and here at home. So I think it all boils down to this. At a moment of escalating crises, at a moment of overlapping challenges in multiple areas, this is a very educated audience, but we also know that foreign policy and national security issues do not generally dominate most of our thinking when we go into the ballot box. But if it does play a role when you go in there, I want you to kind of run through these three tests. Again, who do you want in the situation room when there are multiple crises at once? Who do you think is best positioned to lead an affirmative agenda? And who do you think is best positioned to lead our allies to push back against autocratic regimes? So let me leave it at that, and now you get the alternative take.
Thank you, Charlie. You may have noticed when you arrived tonight that there are note cards on your seats. That's because we want to hear what you have to ask and what you think about what we're discussing. So if you have the opportunity, please write down a question, write down a thought, question probably better, and just hold it up. And one of our people will come and grab that to you, and then they'll bring them to me on stage so we can make sure your voice is heard in this conversation as well. Now, turning to former President Trump. Will Ruger serves as the president of the American Institute for Economic Research. He was previously vice president for research and policy at the Charles Koch Institute and vice president foreign policy at Stand Together. Before that, he taught at Texas State University and the University of Texas at Austin. Also an officer in the U.S. Naval Reserves, Ruger is a veteran of the Afghanistan War, and in 2020 was nominated to serve as the United States ambassador to that country. Will earned his PhD in politics from Brandeis University and his bachelor's degree from College of William and Mary. He is a wide-ranging author, written on any number of topics, but in particular has written a just really brilliant biography of Milton Friedman and also co-authored 2 books on state politics, including Freedom in the 50 States, which is now in its 7th edition. So those of you out there with edition 6, just saying. So yeah, without further ado, Will, the floor is yours.
So it's great to be back in Texas. I miss it a lot. I lived here for a better part of a decade down in Wimberley, Texas, one of the most beautiful spots on the planet. So it's great to be back here. I would say give the same caveats, right? We're going to talk wave tops. I'm only supposed to be up here for 10 minutes. And I also work at a 501c3 organization, so I can't endorse candidates or ask you to vote for a candidate. But I did want to kind of just start by saying that, if you look at the world around us, one question you can ask, an old political tactic is the world a better place now, or was the world a better place 4 years ago? And I think if President Trump here, he would ask you that question. Was there chaos in Ukraine? Was there chaos in the Middle East? Were there problems in Asia to the same extent as there are today? And I think what he would say is there wasn't. And again, that's partly because as a political scientist, what I'd say is, look, foreign policy was a bright spot for President Trump in the first administration, if you think about it, right? So we had gotten off we'd been involved for almost 2 decades in wars in the Middle East, and President Trump was actually one of the first president, I think, since Carter, is that right, not to start a new American conflict of any significance. He helped end America's longest war, our forever war in Afghanistan, through the Doha agreements. His team engineered the Abraham Accords, which brought together old adversaries in the Middle East that people thought could never come together, and provided for and pushed for greater alliance burden sharing to try to get our European allies to free ride less than they were. And so there were, these are just some of the highlights that I think if President Trump were here, he would put to the fore as signature policies that he would be proud of. I would say that a second Trump presidency will look different in very important ways from what you just heard. We might think we might get from President Harris, although it's hard to say, given President Harris, or Vice President Harris, rather, doesn't have a lot of experience on the foreign policy scene. So it's kind of hard to know what it'll look like. President Trump is more of a pragmatist than an idealist. I mean, you heard a lot about American values and idealism just now. President Trump is admittedly more of a pragmatist, more of a realist. I think he'll put American interests first, second, and third. And I think that that's what a lot of Americans are looking at, especially after several decades of America engaging in what might be called a kind of altruistic foreign policy, or what one commentator called foreign policy as social work. President Trump has a very different approach, right? He wants to put the people of Des Moines, Iowa first, not the people of Kandahar province, or of Taiwan, or of Ukraine. It doesn't mean he doesn't care about those issues as they relate to American national interests, but he's going to put the people of Des Moines or the people of Dallas first. And I think that that's one of the reasons why he had a lot of success in the 2016 primary season, because, for example, he went after Jeb Bush on the issue of the Iraq War, saying that this was a disaster, saying that these were not the types of approaches he was going to take. He was going to put Americans first. And I think that part of his viewpoint is that he's a lot less establishment, right? And again, he doesn't sound, at all like what we've seen out of Washington over the last 30 years, but this has been a history of failure after failure, right? The Iraq War, Afghanistan nation-building project, the Libya intervention, which is underrated as a disaster, especially as it related to, terrorists flowed in, arms flowed out, Europeans were faced with an immigration crisis, destabilization in Mali, right? Any number of these things. And so again, I think what President Trump comes at it from is a different approach, an approach that hasn't had that same type of failures. And so I think a lot of Americans look to him and say, like, this isn't business as usual, because business as usual had not been good for Americans. We lost a lot of blood, lost a lot of treasure in these kind of adventurous, ideals-based approaches that we've seen from Republicans and Democrats that have been part of the establishment. And I don't think President Trump comes from that vein. And I think that's a good thing. Now, again, I think he'll be quite different from President Harris. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy to predict. For one thing, changes in the world can create exogenous shocks to any well-laid plans. I mean, think about, fellow Texan George W. Bush. When he campaigned, he talked about no new nation building. And then when you read the 2002 National Security Strategy or listen to his second inaugural, it sounds like something completely different. And part of that was because of what happened in 9/11, and part of that is a real shift in how he thought about the world and how his advisors had advised him. And you can kind of judge the results yourself of that. Secondly is personnel and the kind of choices about advisors, the people who whisper in your ear, matter a lot. And it's not going to be clear for a while who that is. And so my kind of third point about this, which is that it's hard to tell, is that, look, Republican foreign policy is admittedly in flux. So it's in flux in a way that we haven't seen for a long time. So it's, again, I joked with Charles before about, like, it's an easier job for you. The Harris policies are going to be very similar to what you've gotten in a bipartisan way over the last 30 years. And if you like the results of the last 30 years, you're going to love the Harris administration if that happens. But Republican foreign policy is different, right? So the policies of George W. Bush, love them or hate them, these things have been challenged on a very regular basis for about the last 10 years. And that debate is very robust. And there are different camps. So there are those who are kind of like, your father's Republican conservatives on foreign policy, right? What we may call primicists, and they're still around. Many of them have gone over to the Harris camp, like Bill Kristol and the Cheneys. But there are also those what we might call prioritizers and restrainers who bring different things to the table. So prioritizers want to focus on China. They think China is our most important national security challenge, and we should focus our resources there, and we should put less emphasis on Europe and on the Middle East. Restrainers would like to see a much more realistic policy writ large, including making sure that we don't overcommit in Asia. And so these different groups, these three different groups, primicists, prioritizers, and restrainers, are vying for the future of Republican approaches to foreign policy. And I think that that will be seen, we'll see how that bears out over time, whether President Trump wins this election or not. But those are things that can affect our ability to predict what's going to happen. But again, foreign policy, a second foreign policy or a second term for President Trump is going to look like, again, very different, much more pragmatic, much more realist, in some cases more restrained, and in other cases, more forceful when it comes to certain adversaries that the United States faces, just like with Iran. So I'm going to go through the time I have left to talk a little bit about the regions of the world, because I do agree that there are three major regions of the world that we have to pay attention to, but some are more important than others, and we should handle them differently. And again, I'm here less to say what I think and more to say what I think President Trump thinks about this. And in the Q&A and whatnot, we can talk more about what I think, which is not necessarily all that different in many regards. But the point is that on things like transatlantic relations, so our relationship with Europe, I think what you're going to see a President Trump do is similar to what he did in his first term, which is to really push for burden sharing and burden shifting, and that's going to be front and center in how he approaches Europe. I think for a lot of Republicans, including President Trump, he just wants to say, look, there's going to be no more free lunches for Europe. These are wealthy countries that are populous and have been free riding on the American taxpayer for far too long, and it's time to end that. I think that's what President Trump is going to say. And I think he's also going to say, look, we have to focus more on China. That's our most important strategic adversary, and so it's time for Europe to pick up the ball here. Okay? It's time for our NATO allies to do more on what they should care about, right? If they think that Russia is the most important threat to European security, they need to pony up and actually put their money where their mouth is. And not only their money, but they need to create the types of forces that will allow them to defend and deter Europe from Russian aggression, particularly if the United States is more focused on China. So I think there'll be more heat put on especially Germany. I think Germany is going to be in for more of a drubbing like you saw in President Trump's first term. I think when it comes to Ukraine, again, that's still a flashpoint in Republican politics. If you look on the Hill, you see a lot of support even among Republicans for Ukraine, but particularly in the base of the Republican Party and within certain parts of the Republican Party on the Hill, there's more skepticism about continuing to write blank checks for Ukraine, and a desire to see an approach that would lead to a settlement of this conflict. And so I think a President Trump would try to end the war, even if that means pressuring Ukraine. And again, that's going to take certain forms. And, you just heard talk about being mean. Well, look, foreign policy isn't tiddlywinks, right? It's not beanbag. It means that you do have to talk tough, and sometimes you have to talk tough even to your friends and allies, particularly because you want to avoid them engaging in reckless driving. One of the problems of America's foreign policy over the last 30 years, heck, you could say it since the beginning of the Cold War, is that you've seen our allies recklessly drive. Why? Because this is a common feature of moral hazard, right? In economics, in the concept in economics. Right? If you know that you're going to have insurance against a problem, you're more likely to engage in risky behavior. It's basic economics. It applies to seatbelt laws and it applies to foreign policy. So I think that there'll be more of a sense of trying to kind of speak more frankly about what Europe needs to do. Another thing is that alliances aren't seen as sacred, I think, by President Trump. President Biden talked about our sacred allies. Well, once you call them sacred allies, it's like no surprise that they're not going to actually do what you would like them to do to support American interests or to even support their own in a better, more ally-like way. I mean, we talk about allies. Our European allies have traditionally been more dependents than true allies. And I think of President Trump, if you're going to sustain this alliance, he wants them to be real allies, partners who are actually making the same types of sacrifices that American taxpayers have had to make over the last 30 or 80 years. So he's not going to talk about them being sacred. They're more means to an end. And I think that's a more mature approach to foreign policy, and certainly one in keeping actually with our founding fathers. If you've read Washington's farewell address, which I actually just did yesterday, I do it every day, like a good. No, I don't do it every day. I almost wish Americans would every day, because the Council on Foreign Policy is so. It's not to be romantic, but it's just beautiful. The crafting of the farewell address in talking about the importance of America's national interest, the problems of having excessive love for any other country or excessive hatred for any country, because that means that you become the slave of either. You're not independent in your approach. The notion that the United States, should engage the world as much as possible peacefully and defend our interests as needed, but not to be seeking, a kind of more aggressive stance in the world in which we try to own, say, at that time, old world problems when we had our new world priorities. So I love that, and I think that President Trump does channel some of that Washingtonian realism that you see in the farewell address. Now, again, it's hard to say what's going to happen to the future of NATO. Institutions are sticky. Path dependence happens a lot. The deep state, I think, will aim to thwart President Trump if he really tries to make more radical change when it comes to NATO. But I think at least he will be willing to bargain on certain things that President Harris, I think, would have a harder time doing. So, for example, NATO's open door. This is like a religious object in Washington, that NATO has to have an open door. I find it remarkably short-sighted, right? We don't have to take in every country in the world as part of NATO, especially because NATO is unbalanced. It's an American security condominium. We pay the price, they get the benefits in a lot of cases. It's not to say that there aren't some benefits of allies, but a lot of times, like North Macedonia. Does anybody believe they're safer because North Macedonia is part of NATO? Really? Honestly? Right? Are we safer even that Estonia is part of NATO? You think so? Yeah. You don't think it's more likely we would get into a war with Russia because of this? I do. But again, the point is that when it comes to NATO's open door, we might want to shut that, particularly when it comes to states that add very little and increase the risk of a confrontation with another strong power. So, for example, Ukraine and Georgia are states where we ought to think about closing that open door. Okay? Now, again, you want to do it as part of a bargain, maybe, to get an end to this conflict, which is killing so many Ukrainians and is so devastating. On the Middle East, quickly. We should expect robust support for Israel from President Trump, but I don't think President Trump wants to get the United States involved in another Middle Eastern war. If you think back to some of the crisis points with Iran during the first Trump presidency. He was willing to use power, killing Soleimani, for example, but he was not willing to, as he said, to kill lots of Iranians simply because they shot down one of our drones, right? He understood the limits of what he wanted to do there, and he categorized those based on America's interests, and understood that getting involved in another forever war is not necessarily in our best interests. That being said, I think Trump is going to approach Iran more forcefully than what we've seen. I think trying to deter Iran from causing problems in the Middle East, and they are an actor that has created instability in the Middle East, and I think President Trump would try to use American power in a way that would deter. Again, I don't think he wants to fight a war, and he certainly, I don't think, wants another regime change war, but I do think it'll be a more forceful approach. I think he'll want to build on the Abraham Accords, and I think that depending on how Iranian relations go, we could see Trump again talk about withdrawing American troops from Syria. It's dumb to have American forces in Syria today. We should be pulling them back, and I think President Trump kind of understood that, because at one point in the first administration, he talked about doing so, and I think it would have been better for us if he had. In terms of China, right, the key variable for Trump's China policy is going to be what happens to China, right? If China continues to lose some steam economically, then I think that's going to dull some of the, exigencies around trying to more severely combat the rise of China. If China doesn't show weakness and seems militarily on the march, then I think the prioritizers, the more hawkish views of China will win out. And I think that President Trump, understands that China is our most important strategic challenge, and that's one of the reasons why you've seen some of the confrontation on economic policy, as well as a view that China has been getting the best of the United States and needs to kind of put the brakes on that. So, the big question, though, for Trump, I think mostly will be, what economic tools of statecraft is he willing to use as a bargaining chip, and where he's willing to come down on it, right? So you talked about 20 to 60% tariffs. Is that an opening gambit for a real estate guy, or is that actually what he wants to do? And that'll be an interesting question. And so I will close there because, again, in the Q&A, we'll have a lot of chance to kind of dig into this because we can only hit the wave tops. But what I would say is that I think that a second Trump presidency will look a lot like the first one, and I think there were a lot of signature successes, and I would guess there would be even more in a second Trump administration, because I'm going to guess that some of the personnel that will be involved will be more aligned with President Trump's instincts and vision than the first time, in which he had a lot of members of the blob and establishment that were actually undercutting his instincts and approaches, and I think in a deleterious fashion. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask each of you guys a question so you can formulate sort of response to each other. I also remind everyone again that there are cards on your seats. My mom has one, and I'm sure yes, my tie is just the right tie, Mom. Thank you. That's a good question to ask. And please hold up your hand, and we'll get those cards because I want to make sure that you guys are part of the discussion as well. So as you think about how you want to respond to each other, let me begin, though, with a fundamental question, I think, and you alluded to it at the very end, Will, that Donald Trump is likely to bring in people who are more simpatico with his thinking this time around. One presumes Kamala Harris will do the same. Who are the people that you think would be populating a Trump foreign policy establishment or foreign policy apparatus? And the same thing for Kamala Harris. Who are they, and what should we know about them, or where do they come from?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a tough question because you're asking me to predict individuals, and these are complicated matters of personnel choice. And there's a lot of, very talented people out there that could fill any of these positions. What I would say is I think we should go back to President Trump's Mayflower address. I was actually there, and it was really fascinating to hear because in 2016, it seemed like such a shift in that speech away from what we had been hearing, especially from Republicans, for 30 years. But he said, hey, look, we need people who are new and are practical men and women, right? People who bring new ideas rather than those who have fancy resumes but a long history of failure. And I think that means that a second Trump administration would be more open-minded about bringing in people that aren't the same olds. And again, I don't want to besmirch people who in public service who do their best, they're well-intentioned, they're sacrificing in many ways for their country, and I applaud that. But it is the case, though, that there are some people, especially that are kind of, they just linger and hang around Washington, and they're just part of the furniture of Washington, that have just made mistake after mistake after mistake. And there's no accountability. Absolutely no accountability. They still go on the same TV shows. They still get invited to give, expensive talks to businesses. I mean, I'm sorry, but we need to turn the page on a lot of these people, and I think a second Trump administration would be more likely to look at some of the people who weren't intimately involved in those error after error. Whether that's people, like maybe Bridge Colby, who's a kind of prominent prioritizer. That might be somebody if we're going to ask for a particular individual. But, there's a lot of other good people that have been, again, they have expertise and experience, but they haven't been so intimately associated with these failures as you've seen with others, whether generals that have been brought in or civilians. I mean, think about Toria Nuland. This woman has been involved in so many mistakes, and yet she keeps popping up over and over again. I think President Trump's going to avoid that as much as possible.
Thank you. For Harris, what kind of person should we be thinking about is going to populate her cabinet and foreign policy apparatus?
Yeah. Look, for those of you who aspire to go to Washington one day, this is like a favorite sweepstakes, like guessing who gets where. But as you heard, these are complicated personnel decisions. Let me say kind of two things off the bat. One is on the Trump side. If you liked Trump's foreign policy, if you liked some of what you heard articulated, but also what we saw towards the end of his administration, the less restrained use of the American military, even domestically here in the United States, this is what you're going to get with Trump, because the guardrails are going to fade away. And so think of Trump at his Trumpiest, and then think of those advisors who want to encourage that. So that's not a particular person, but those are the type of people he will be selecting. On the Harris side of the equation, we're also in for change, I think. All the top cabinet posts, these are very tiring positions. You cannot really do them for as long as the people who have done them. So at the top, we're likely to see an entirely new cabinet. I think there are two things to think. One, some will come from Washington because they know how to do these things. But Kamala Harris has talked pretty regularly, I was just reading about this, that what she wants to do is empower those who have been outsiders to become more of the inside players within the system. I don't think you'll see drastically new faces, but the composition of a cabinet is likely to look different than it has before.
Are we going to get a Cheney in a Harris cabinet?
She hasn't consulted me, but I would note that Kamala Harris has said more than once that she is open to having Republicans serve in her administration. So I don't think it's beyond the realm of the possible, but also knowing that Liz Cheney is not the only formerly your granddad's type of Republican who might populate the upper reaches of a Harris administration.
He asked you a question. You get to ask him a question.
Sorry, Jeff. Little imperialism there, huh?
No, but I forgot to mention something very important, to be honest, which is that this is not a debate, but were it a debate, Charlie's already lost because Will very wisely inserted the phrase pony up in his work. So, sorry, dude.
But actually, let's talk about the ponying up, because I think what you heard was a really well articulated vision that if we examine a little bit more closely, begins to fall apart. So first of all, there is no argument from the Harris or the Democratic side of the ledger that we want our allies and partners to do more. We simply have to have everyone doing more because the strategic circumstances have dramatically changed and in many ways shifted away from us. The question becomes, how do you think you're likely to get to more? And is it by simply leaning much more not nicely, or by having the United States invest more? Now, a couple data points for you on this. So when Biden came into office, when we were talking about the free riders in Europe, 9 out of 30 NATO allies were paying their fair share as qualified by 2% of their GDP towards defense. At this point, we have 23 of 32 NATO members paying their fair share. If we shift our gaze to the Indo-Pacific, we've seen the largest commitment by Japan in a post-war setting. We've seen a fundamental revolution in how Australia thinks about and is willing to fund its foreign policy, and likewise by the South Koreans. So again, the question is not whether or not our allies will do more. They will when they think their security is affected. But how do you think you are likely to lead them to doing more? And is it by simply hitting them over the head or investing alongside and with and around them? I think that's a really important point here. Another point that you heard articulated, I think, really, really well, I don't know if this is a question or just a debate that I'm now getting onto, is this idea that Will has articulated that because Asia is so important, notice I did not say China, I said Asia or the Indo-Pacific is so important, therefore do less in the Middle East, do less in Europe, with the assumption that therefore others will pick up the slack. It would be really nice if we could divide the world and cabin off how things work, but that's actually not how it works, and that's not how any of the leaders in those countries think it works. The reason, post the invasion of Ukraine, that you have the largest commitment by Asian leaders to support Ukraine, the Japanese, the Australians, the South Koreans are supplying 3 million artillery shells to the Ukrainians, is because they see the security of Ukraine intimately connected to their security in the Indo-Pacific region, specifically on Taiwan and China. That is, the leader of Japan has said that we see that what happens in Europe today could well happen tomorrow, so therefore we fundamentally do not want Ukraine to lose, and we want to ensure that Russia does. So these theaters are connected in ways that I think that this neat division of labor kind of puts aside. Final point I would say to you, I actually think that Will and I have a really good discussion and argument, and it's a philosophical one about what makes more sense. A larger imprint of the United States, a less big imprint of the US, more resources, less resources. All of those are eminently debatable propositions, I think we should say. The problem is that with a Trump presidency, this neatly articulated worldview that you held will not last more than 1 second. And he doesn't subscribe to what Will has just put on, because Trump very so frequently intimidates maybe China on one day, but all of our allies the next, that we are just paying a premium on a daily basis for America being an unsteady player in world affairs. So I guess those aren't questions, but so much points for Will to respond to.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, I don't, as a foreign policy scholar, right, I tend to want to talk in kind of nuance or to complicate things, which is, you know, no foreign policy scholar worth their salt would say that alliances are always bad. If I'm Prussia in the 1860s, I want some friends. If you're the United States in the early 1800s, you're less prone to think allies are good for you and more likely to think that they'll get you into foreign wars, that you're going to end up having a problem. And that's one of the reasons why George Washington and then Jefferson, who had previously been a more pro-French ally person, talked about it, you know, the dangers of entangling alliances. So the answer is it all depends. And the problem I think that you see with the foreign policy establishment that is, you know, again, like President Harris's, President Harris would be kind of full up with, you know, the very typical figures that are at the Atlantic Council and at Brookings and in other places that buy into some of these sacred alliances notions, is that they tend to focus only on the positives or the potential positives of alliances, and they don't dwell enough on the pathologies. So, for example, like I talked about, the free rider problem, a huge problem in our foreign policy. But also other things like being chain ganged. So chain ganging is a pathology of alliances. So if you remember, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Hopefully some people still remember that movie, and the guy falls out and everybody else goes along with him. That's a real problem in foreign policy. Right? World War I, you could argue, is an example of being chain ganged into a war. Germany got chain ganged by the Austrians. Okay? We may have been chain ganged by the French and the British. But the point is that chain gang can happen today. I'm very worried about the possibility of an escalatory spiral in Ukraine that could lead to us getting chain ganged into a war because of some of these notions about allies and partners. Then there's reckless driving, right? And I talked about this earlier, but we've seen this. The United States giving a backstop to sacred allies means that they behave in ways that are oftentimes imprudent. We saw that in Georgia in 2008. We saw that, I think, in relation to Libya when it came to what the Italians and others wanted. These are real pathologies, and they're dangerous. And they're even more dangerous in a world that is a world of great power competition than they were in the kind of heady days of the most salient unipolar moment, where we could make mistakes and they led to thousands of Americans getting killed in Iraq. But making mistakes when it comes to, say, a conflict with Russia or China could lead to the incineration of an American city, or at least could lead to a conflict in which thousands of Americans are dying every month in a conflict. That's scary, and I think something that means that we have to take seriously the notion that alliances aren't these kind of free adornments that you put on your foreign policy Christmas tree.
I do want to ask one question about this, because everything that you say about alliances is something that Winston Churchill would have said. You know, he always said that the worst thing about having allies is having allies, and but tell me about Trump's very unusual response by unusual I mean I think he's the only president since 1949 to cast doubt on our Article 5 commitments to NATO. Now, I understand that you're worried about being chain-ganged into a problem, but I have a really hard time trying to understand why that was a useful thing for Donald Trump to say, even if he thought it or even if he wanted to say it privately. Why go public with it?
Yeah, I don't work for the Trump administration or the Trump campaign. I'm a political scientist who runs the Economic Research Center. I think that when it comes to issues related to the future of our alliances, these are things that we, I think as a public, should be willing to kind of challenge and to think about new approaches, and also to recognize even the limits of what our commitments mean. I mean, one of the things that I think, I was at a debate one time between Barry Posen and Ivo Dalger, and Ivo had been the U.S. ambassador to NATO, I think is what he was. And this issue of Article 5 came up. What does it mean? And Ivo, as a fair, honest individual, noted that Article 5 is not what most people think in their kind of high school textbook. It doesn't commit you to go to war as soon as an ally is in trouble or is even invaded. It commits you to doing something. But that could be as little as a stern letter of regret to full-on, defensive fighting, hot war in defense of that ally. And so I think that the issue of what our commitments mean is something that is probably best said in peacetime rather than in war when it actually comes to it. That we ought to be having a conversation about what we're willing to do so that we don't stumble into issues where America's like, really? We're actually committed to defending Saudi Arabia? We ought to have a conversation about what these alliance commitments mean. Are we really willing to defend, say, Taiwan in a conflict with China? Now, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. That's why I love these panels and why I came here, because I think we have to have a public conversation about what these things mean. But that means that we can't sacralize foreign policy means. And that's my chief problem with the foreign policy establishment when it comes to allies. It's not that I'm against allies, I'm against sacralizing them, because that gets you into the pathologies.
Well, I want to turn to some of the questions that you guys offered because they're actually really quite good. Well done. Let me begin with this one, and I'll let you guys decide who wants to answer first. Does U.S. deficit spending affect foreign policy? And when will the strength of the dollar begin to affect what a president can do?
Yeah, I'm kind of looking for an ally who stepped in and put this on a tee for me. It's got to be somewhere. Is my mom here? Your mom is.
That was his question.
Very good. It's a great question, right? So
you can get a copy of the 7th edition of the book.
Or the 8th one coming out next year. Look, our national debt and deficits is a terrible thing that, again, Washington has foisted upon us. Even a Keynesian wouldn't argue you should be running deficits during economic good times, but we've seemed to do this over and over again. The fact is that we're over $35 trillion in debt. This has a pinch on our future and the future of our children and our grandchildren. And you got to remember, and this is why, and I don't even need to answer this question myself. Let me trot up here the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. I wish he were in the audience. I'd invite him up to give this. I reference this all the time. Admiral Mike Mullen, when he was the chairman, was asked, what is the greatest national security threat to the United States? And I'm not as smart as the admiral, I guess, because I would have said something like, well, it's probably China, terrorism, not as big a problem as it was 20 years ago, but still a challenge, right? He said, our national debt and deficits. And he explained that this is because we're going to kill the golden goose. The American economy, our prosperity, our ability to harness economic power is the golden goose that helps us build military power that can have the world's most strongest national defense establishment. If we kill that golden goose, we're toast. And there was an article in National Review that I would recommend by a friend of mine, Michael Brennan Doherty, talking about how he argues that restraint, which is my favorite grand strategy, is inevitable in part because we've created some of these problems for ourselves. We haven't built American economic strength the way we should, and we have all these problems economically that mean we're going to have to choose restraint to save our country. So I think that that's important.
So I don't think you have a large argument for me on this, but I would call your attention to maybe one or two extra points that we should throw in here for our consideration. So the first is, if we know that a well-functioning American economy is the foundation source for everything else that we do, the question is, who do you evaluate to have a sounder economic set of policies that's likely to grow the American economy? Again, I'm not an economist, so I can just quote the same economists that all of you read about too, but one is likely to kind of quadruple our deficit, that would be Trump's, and the other one is not. We can also look at investments that have been made into the American economy. If you look at the CHIPS and Science Act, if you look at the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has seen billions of dollars pushed to those parts of the American economy that we think will allow us to compete most effectively in the 21st century, and also have seen a tail of allies investing in the American economy that has happened under a Biden administration. A second thing that I think that we probably need to highlight a little bit is we pay an enormous amount on defense. We pay an enormous amount on defense, but we could pay more. Because if you look at, historically, the data points, we have a great Cold War historian with us.
True.
Oh, I was pointing to Will, sorry. But the point is that the average amount that we spent during the Cold War was 6% of our GDP. We are now hovering around 3% of our commitments, and the world has just become more dangerous. Now, this is a debate, I think, for both candidates about what they'd be willing to take on, what entitlements they would cut, whether or not they would push resources to this. But also, when you think about the worldviews that you had articulated by us too, inartfully approximating the Trump and the Harris view, which one is actually going to cost you more money? Now, there's an argument that Trump's policy, because it would see America doing less and ipso facto, all of our allies would do more, would cost you less. But I think there's actually a different way to think about this. That if America withdrew its support from Ukraine tomorrow, and now that we have 32 and not 30 members of NATO, see Finland, see Sweden, and now you have Vladimir Putin bordering NATO, the increase in the amount of spending that America and its allies would have to take together would shoot through the roof. So again, there's no argument that more needs to be put towards national security. The question is, who is more placed to do that in a better sense? Second point I would just make on this is when we say national security, we generally go straight, I think both of us are guilty of this, to go into the defense establishment. But that should not be all that we're talking about. If we think about the money that we put towards the State Department, to USAID, to Peace Corps, which, by the way, are all extensions of American influence in the world, right? Which candidate is likely to push more resources to expanding this? Again, I say I spend a lot of my time on the Indo-Pacific region. The United States is outcompeted by China in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly in the Pacific Islands, because we don't have embassies there. You need to actually fund the State Department to open our embassies. You need to fund the Peace Corps to make sure that they have presence on the ground. That's actually how you convert American influence, I would say. So more resources, absolutely. The question is, what's going to put us on a more sustainable footing to actually get there?
Yeah. Hey, Jeff, do you mind if I jump in? So a couple of things. One is, how's that Inflation Reduction Act going? Because inflation is still well above the Federal Reserve targets and has been for a while. And our food prices are enormously expensive, and so are so many other things. So these are not great policy proposals. Number two is, you mentioned this issue of percentage of GDP going to national security spending. I don't think this is the right metric, right? If the United States economy were 100 times larger, would you say that we should spend 100 times more on national defense to make sure that we're keeping up with the percentage of GDP? As the American economy grows, we want national defense to decline as a percentage of GDP, because military spending, once you've secured yourself as a country, does not have the type of multiplier for our economy as does spending in the private sector. So I don't think we should just want to have more and more. And I think this is part of what I react against when it comes to establishment thinking, is the idea that more Peace Corps money, more USAID money, more State Department money, more defense money is always necessarily better for America's actual security. I just don't think it is. I think we could be spending a lot less. And I guess I would also challenge this thing that I think goes to the heart of some of the debates between primacy and restraint, which is there's lots of problems in the world, but those problems aren't all America's problems. And the world is not so interconnected. It is interconnected, but it's not so interconnected that there aren't seams in the fiber of the international system. There's been a war. There's been the most brutal war of our lifetime has been in the Congo, and it hasn't caused a ripple effect in terms of American security or even global security. So sometimes things happen. They're bad for the places that they happen to, but the United States doesn't have to get involved. And so again, more is not always better. Sometimes we need to practice the restraint of Washington, of John Quincy Adams, of Grover Cleveland, of Calvin Coolidge.
Don't.
Them is fighting words about John Quincy Adams.
We're running out of time here.
Next question.
Next. Okay, we're running out of time, so I want to go kind of a speed round here. So think short.
Got it.
Yeah, very short. Was it a mistake for the Trump administration to pull the United States out of the Iran agreement? The Iran nuclear agreement.
Be concise.
Exactly. I'm thinking. There were lots of problems with the Iran agreement that needed to be, I think, restructured. And so it wasn't a perfect agreement, and I think the Trump administration had legitimate concerns about that.
Yes, it was a mistake to pull out because it allowed us to stop giving our leverage on their nuclear program, which would not hold us back from pressuring them on other fronts.
You're going to like this question better.
Okay.
How does the Kamala Harris foreign policy differ from the Bush-Cheney foreign policy?
I'm going to let you answer that.
No, I'm asking you. Yeah.
I do not see a Kamala Harris freedom agenda in the same way that you saw under a George W. Bush foreign policy. I do not see, because fundamentally we are what, 2000, 2004, we're 25 years progressed from that. The world just fundamentally looks different. We are not, as Will articulated, putting most of our resources, putting many of our men and women in uniform into the Middle East. We have equities there. We have interests, as you saw when the United States helped defend Israel in April and mustered a coalition to shoot down those Iranian missiles. But that is not where we're putting most of our resources at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see what the bargain was for Cheney to go out on the stump for Harris. Why is Bill Kristol supporting Harris? Why are so many neoconservatives abandoning the Republican Party for Harris? I mean,
I don't think it's over foreign policy.
Oh, oh, really?
Oh, really? Okay,
really?
so
you don't think the foreign? I mean, I think you're right that it's more than that. But foreign policy is a key, critical part of that. You're understating how important foreign policy is to neoconservatism.
No. But I'm running out of time, so I want to ask you one more question to both of you, which is, I have often made the statement, my students have heard this any number of times, that there are several basic principles that Republican and Democratic administrations have believed since 1945, which Donald Trump does not. You've articulated those. Would you say that Trump is a complete divergence from the norm, or is he pushing us in a new, different direction while holding fast to some of the basics of American foreign policy since 1945, alliances, free trade, motion of democracy, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, our commitment to some of those has waxed and waned. It's oftentimes easy to say that during the entire Cold War, or since the beginning of the Cold War until like 2016, that somehow there's been, everything has been moving in the same direction. I mean, That's just not the case, right? There's been waxing and waning of commitment to free trade, waxing and waning to commitment to democracy promotion. We're on a college campus. We weren't exactly promoting democracy in Chile in the early 70s. We weren't exactly promoting democracy in Afghanistan in 1979 forward. I don't think that supporting the Mujahideen was a bad idea, but it certainly wasn't democracy promotion. So again, I think that there's too much of this. And one thing I would point out is, oftentimes what you hear from establishment people is, look, for the last 70 years, NATO has been so successful, and our commitment to the liberal rules-based international order has been so successful. They're largely judging that on the first 30, not the whole run. The fact is that since the end of the Cold War, American foreign policy has been largely riddled by failures. And I think that when we view this whole range of options out there, we shouldn't just retreat to this past model, because that past model was built for a world in which we had a Cold War with the Soviet Union that was both an ideological and a military and political threat. That's a different world than we face today. It's much more complicated, and we need a much more nuanced and I think much more varied approach than simply like more allies, more commitments, more American leadership, more altruism, more commitment to the liberal rules-based order, which itself is kind of like what Voltaire said about the Holy Roman Empire. It's neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. I mean, how rules-based is what a lot of the United States has done. The Iraq War wasn't exactly something that was a kind of like substantiation of the UN Charter, right?
I'm going to take that up.
Yeah.
I'm going to preempt your question here, because there are two things I think we need to keep in mind. Number one, it has been the most successful alliance that we've seen in American history and in history. And let me point you to not distant history, but what everyone knows, the 20th century. We have run the experiment not once, but twice, of what a less engaged, less forward-positioned America looks like. And it doesn't create stability. It creates a green light and power vacuums for rapacious states to push as hard as they can, which eventually drags us into war. Point two, that is not to say that what we did from 1945 or 1947 or 1952, depending on how you start and team the beginning of the Cold War, was static. There were adjustments all the time, and now we are in a completely new era. Let me highlight, as we, I think, depart, because I think this is something Will and I agree on a lot, that the challenges are cascading and getting larger. We are not just facing China. We now have a proto-alliance between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And when I make the point about this is a competition of coalitions, because you need to have more on your side, willing to do more, invest more, and bring more to the fight. The question is, how do we muster those coalitions to be advantageous to America and American values?
Yeah, there's so many things I disagree with about that, even though it sounds nice. It's just for starters, right? And I go back to this. And I say this, having been on Fox News and enjoying, having been there, but if you listen to Fox News or the Wall Street Journal or a lot of the think tanks in Washington, the sky is always falling. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think we create a lot of our own problems in the world. It doesn't mean that there aren't problems for other countries, but those aren't always ours, for example. And so I think we need to do triage. What are the things that really affect our national interests? What are the things that are implicated by it, but that might choose different options rather than maximalist ones? And what doesn't actually matter that much? And I think that's an important thing we need to do. I mean, look, we have two big oceans between us and the rest of the world. We have weak neighbors who are friendly to us. We have the world's strongest military. We have the world's strongest Navy. We have the world's strongest Air Force. We have the world's second strongest Air Force in the Navy's Air Force, right? We have nuclear weapons. Defense is dominant in the system, which means it's hard to invade a country and succeed easily. Nationalism means it's hard to incorporate states that you conquer into your political community. And the balance of power in Eurasia is not threatened to be overturned. And in fact, a lot of what we've done is to try to push these countries together rather than trying to take advantage of natural rifts. I mean, Kissinger was brilliant in the fact that he understood that the Sino-Soviet alliance was not natural, and I think we ought to recognize that. So I don't think the world is actually as dangerous as we oftentimes think, and it's easy to romanticize the past. I mean, the Cold War was really dangerous. Jeff could tell us that, okay? The other thing, too, is this whole thing about, like, we're going to get dragged in. I just don't like inevitable arguments like that. Okay, the reason why we got dragged into World War I were bad decisions by Woodrow Wilson and his advisors like Colonel House. Okay, we didn't have to get dragged into World War I. It was a mistake to get dragged into one. And even a neoconservative like Niall Ferguson said it was a mistake for Britain to get into World War I. So it's not inevitable that you get dragged into it, because let me ask you about the First World War between all of the West and Germany in 1871. Oh, that's right, it didn't happen, because Germany invaded France, and it was a localized war that other states stayed out of, and it didn't lead to the inevitability of being dragged in. So it's not the case that aggression by, say, a power like Germany inevitably leads the United States to get in. We don't have to. We can make choices. We have choices.
Unfortunately, one of the choices we do not have is to keep going, because I know everybody has a schedule and dinner reservations and things to study for, and papers due. I want to thank you first, and then I want to make an observation. I want to thank you guys for doing exactly what I asked, which is having a civil and thoughtful conversation, and for really helping us understand better, I think, the prospective Trump plan and the prospective Harris plan. So thank you for that. I want to make an observation, which is the 1930s, in particular 1939, have been in the news a lot lately. We can have a long and useless discussion about how useful historical analogies are, but it strikes me that we are still in 2024 having the debate of 1940 about what role we should play in the world. A debate which Americans never solved in 1940 or 41. Someone else solved it for us. And what I am concerned about, I think, is that 20 years from now, 40 years from now, 60 years from now, we will meet here and be having this same exact discussion. Maybe I should hope for that, because that means no one else will have solved it for us. So let me rephrase that. I'll see you in 60 years. Good. Thank you all tonight for coming.